So, as Simon said, this was put together to sort of encourage writing for the website, but also to just encourage activist writing more generally, and to sort of inspire, hopefully, you all to sort of take up your pens or your keyboards, and produce some interesting pieces. We've got, including myself, free speakers slash teachers today. Maya is a writer, activist, and freelance journalist with 10 years of experience, currently head of media and communications for the IWGB Union, and runs Justice for Gaia, which advocates for survivors, and is writing a book, Justice for All of Us, which collects the stories of bereaved campaigners who have lost loved ones in custody of the state. Tanzi Hoskins is an award-winning writer and journalist specializing in the garment industry. She is the author of Footwork, What Your Shoes Are Doing to the World, and Stitched Up, the anti-capitalist book of fashion. Dave is on the editorial board of Anti-Capitalist Resistance, a member of Socialist Resistance, and Hackney and Stoke Newington Labour Party, a contributor to International Viewpoint and Europe Solidaire Sans Frontières. And we're all going to be sort of speaking in different sections. I'll just give a very quick outline of what to expect. So after my introduction, we're going to have a series of introductions to different aspects of journalism in this field, given by all of us. And then I'm going to look specifically at some of the nuts and bolts of writing, and what's required. It won't be grammar heavy, but it will touch on a couple of sort of core concepts. And then Dave, Tanzi, and Maya are going to take it in turn to look at specific pieces, which will be shared in the chat, and which you should have by email, to illustrate good and bad writing and what's actually entailed. After that, we'll have a lunch period from 1 o'clock to 2:30, and you'll be given a series of prompts to write your own short pieces. These don't really have to be particularly long. In fact, it's best if they're sort of just more exemplary pieces. And then in session 2, we're going to come back with Dave and I, and look at those pieces and workshop them a little bit and talk about writing in various more ways. So to start the session proper, I'm going to hand over to Dave, who's going to be looking at why we write. And with that, I'll let Dave commence.
Okay.
It's not a good start. We've lost Dave.
Probably be best if maybe Dave turns off his video.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? I've taken the video off, so it might be easier. Yeah. Can you hear me? Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. Sorry about my video. It was this morning. It was working perfectly yesterday. Just to add to a point to what Conrad said before, this is predominantly on print media. Obviously, further down the road, we will want to do work on podcasts.
We've lost Dave again. So we jump on to the next bit, and then we'll try and get Dave, even if Dave needs to dial back in or get on his laptop, we'll do that.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I'm doing the next section, and there's no real necessity of order, so that should be fine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about audience and who we're writing for. Anti-capitalist resistance is a relatively small organization, and most of our readers are active in the labor or ecological movements with a general interest in progressive ideas such as struggles of the oppressed, workers leveraging their collective power to improve conditions and salaries, the limitations of conservative social institutions and ideas, from those on education to those about how we meet basic human needs for everyone. I will be talking about our audience specifically, but much of what I say will be generalizable beyond ACR. Every writer assumes a reader, at minimum themselves, and journalism necessarily considers a very general reader, and the need to effectively communicate to them. Analytics from the application Fathom, which we use to track our website data, show that many of our top articles are theoretical, but that there is also a keen interest in new perspectives on topical news subjects, from the energy crisis to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But our readership has also been cultivated with articles on culture and more whimsical or polemical pieces. It can be misleading to just look at the most popular articles when our core readership, those who keep returning to us over and over again, to find what we have to say on a given thing, seem to enjoy the diversity of content we offer. That is why, however important the question of audience might be, it is also important to not consider our readers or what interests them too narrowly. We have readers for original political poetry, we have readers for gallery, television, and film reviews, we have readers for discussions on aesthetics and art, as well as readers who want to know more about the state of the right to protest in contemporary Britain or the treatment of asylum seekers. A diverse audience with diverse interests means that while it is good to consider who you are writing for, you should not therefore be intimidated and consequently box in your writing. To illustrate, generally our news pieces have an eye to the UK, where most of our readers are based, but this is supplemented by an interest in international questions that are relevant to readers everywhere and engage with people in the United States, Canada, Europe, etc. too, from where we also receive plenty of attention according to Fathom. As UK-based socialists, an important local struggle or new piece on legislation will get our attention, but we appreciate the international context in which we are placed, and so do those who regularly visit ACR. Therefore, when thinking about an audience, it is not just or even necessarily mainly the content of the article that matters, but also how a piece arrives to those who will want to read it and how its form, its style, legibility appeals to those people. The majority of those who click onto ACR will find us through social media, which makes having engaging, timely content on subjects that connect to a broader conversation important. It also means that when thinking about readers, it is worthwhile further considering how this will impact on the ways in which to promote a piece. Many of the most successful articles are promoted by their writers in places likely to have an interested crowd, through responses and hashtags on Twitter, sharing to the right group on Facebook, and so on and so forth. We also receive interest from similar groups on the left, those who share pieces in their own online spaces and through pages on Facebook, WhatsApp groups, and their own websites. They are more likely to be interested in subjects to do with socialism, how it is enacted, what it means, and the challenges it faces in the never-changing world. We can therefore say that there are two types of readers we generally attract, with considerable overlap between them. First, there are readers who seek a deeper left perspective on current events, from the role and structures of the Labour Party in British politics to the social, economic, cultural, and political impacts of coronavirus. And second, there are readers who seek to engage in abstracter concerns about organization, history, psychology, identity, oppression, or the nature of power today. Because of the overlap, it is on the one hand good for our news pieces to still engage with contentious ideas. Our purpose is not merely to be a successful outlet, after all, but to also convey a certain politics for our website. That means that abstracter pieces should try as far as possible to be accessible too, and accessible specifically to those as yet unfamiliar or just less familiar with the technical language and shared concepts of socialism. Where such language is required, if it is obscure especially, it can be defined and even potentially explained. It is always a good idea to have in mind a reader for a particular piece, someone with whom you are communicating as though you are almost in a one-to-one conversation. That prevents you from getting merely lost in your own thoughts, assuming that people have knowledge that they do not possess or agree with positions that you are therefore leaving largely unargued in your actual prose. Many people who are sympathetic to our articles will be coming from a vast range of different places and lived experiences. They will have unthought prejudices that can nonetheless be shifted, as well as their own situated insights into the world that we as writers from our perspective perhaps lack. It is therefore important to lucidly engage with people in a way that is humble, not teacherly nor didactic, but also one that appreciates the need to persuade as well as to merely relate observations. If you imagine a complex reader, one with their own concerns, limitations, and expertise, someone who is not necessarily well versed in philosophical or economic literature, but curious enough to learn, you will quickly start to craft articles, whether theoretical or not, that are geared to start a conversation rather than to end one. Such articles are the likeliest to seize the attention of the broadest of our readership base. But not every ACR reader will be equally drawn to every article, and so it is worth considering the type of person a particular piece might most excite, and to further consider, as well as the most general reader as described already, a more specific one for whom you are writing. If you are writing about employment conditions in universities, for example, you will probably attract quite a lot of different people within and beyond academia, but you are likelier to pull in more teachers and students and should consider them a little in formulating your language and researching your topic. Likewise, if you are writing on the Labour left or the Green Party, it is beneficial to consider how those who belong to such groups are likely to talk to each other, what their concerns are going to be at the time of writing and on the topic at hand. I will conclude now by reiterating, there is no reason to become anxious when thinking about your audience. Rather, by reflecting on the living people who will need to read and take in your ideas, whatever you want to write on can be made more lucid, more relevant, and more engaging. Thank you. And I don't know if Dave is back, or have we still... No. In that case, just going to check who's next on the list. Tanzi. If Tanzi, if you want to come in with your piece.
Yeah, cool. Can everybody hear me okay? Give me a little thumbs up. Yes, you can. Great. So I want to talk a bit about the kinds of articles that people could think about writing. Because the good thing about the anti-capitalist website, and also, you know, writing is in general, is that there are loads of shapes and sizes, so everybody can find something that fits them and that appeals to them, or a variety of things that they like. The other thing I want to make really clear is that when I'm not just talking about writing articles here in the sort of traditional sense. I think it's really important to think about website content and political input in terms of photography and taking making videos and short films and potentially, you know, doing podcasts and things like that. So there really is something for everyone, and it's a really good opportunity, I think, to practice things like photography skills. It's a really good inroad. So a really, really, really cool starting point, if you're interested in starting to do political writing, is literally going along to a protest or a picket line and writing down what you see and hear. You know, so this is kind of like, you know, this is like an action report of a demo or a strike or a picket or something that's happening. And this could be something that was really big. It could be like the recent, you know, some of the recent demonstrations around the Ukraine crisis, or it could be that, you know, it could be the, I personally went along to some of the UAL UCU strikes and the picket lines in King's Cross lately, or it could be a hospital near you that's being shut down. So where, you know, wherever there's a bit something happening, you know, you go along, make sure you take photos, take videos, get some great quotes from the speakers, either when they're up on the platform, maybe talking, or go along and interview them. You know, you can record all these kind of quotes just on your mobile phone at the moment. Also chat with people just in the crowd, people who've come along, and literally ask them why they are attending. And this is always really popular content. You know, the people who are holding these demonstrations, as you know, as we all know in this room, want this kind of coverage. You know, they want good, accurate, empathetic reporting about why they're spending their Saturday or their Monday morning out on a rainy picket line. And I think a good thing is to aim for like 500 to 800 words with this kind of thing. It doesn't have to be massive. You know, you want short, sharp, accurate reporting. Another Maya's just putting a really helpful thing in the chat, is that, like, you know, make contact with trade unions and ask to go on their press list. So, you know, and follow them on Twitter and follow activists on Twitter, so you know where things are happening. A way of deepening this reporting practice is to do more in-depth interviews. with local activists or campaigners or national campaigners. And there is literally so much material out there, and it's extremely undercovered. We don't have like trade union reporters in the way that we used to have. We don't have industrial struggle reporters, and a lot of the reporting on social justice campaigns is not very good. And again, like, make sure that you're accurate in what you're saying and fact check what's being said. Make sure ahead of time to think about what you want to ask, and a good place for that is like, what are you curious about, and what is not being said in any coverage. Again, like, take really great photographs, or if you don't feel comfortable taking photographs, link up with, like, find a friend who's a photographer or a videographer or an illustrator, and do these more in-depth interviews. And again, you aim for like 800 words. I think it's a good benchmark. This is one really close to my heart. So, calls for solidarity for strikes or international, or struggles that are international. And for me, like, this is so important. This is what a lot of my own personal work is. And I see it as a central part of international solidarity work. So, you could be interviewing activists in Myanmar. There's the food panda drivers in Taiwan have recently gone on strike. You've got garment workers in Sri Lanka. Whatever kind of sector or country or region interests you, don't see these as things that that you shouldn't be writing about, because you should. And again, like, do your research. Don't go in there needing everything explained to you. Like, know what the situation is about. Don't waste people's time. Again, especially with activists in the global south, time is precious. So think about what you're asking. Do you need a translator? Maybe you'll need a translator. I have to use translators a lot of the time, but that shouldn't be a barrier. But it's particularly with global south work, like, have a proper think and talk to the person you're interviewing about whether your source is at risk. If they talk to you, do they need to be anonymous in this interview or article that you're writing about? What source protection do you have in place? And I'd be very happy to talk to anyone who wants to do this kind of work about source protection skills, making sure you don't get your sources arrested or locked up. And again, think about how you're going to illustrate this article. Like, possibly you won't be able to take photos if it's really sensitive, but maybe they could supply some photos, or maybe you need an illustrator to do it. So those are some of the kind of factual reporting articles you can do. Then we have the world of, like, comment and review and opinion, which is a lush part of leftist writing. And one of the ways I started writing, and I would offer this as something that's really cool to do, and very, like, accessible to everyone, is kind of doing undercover work about yourself. So a series that I did really long time ago was called, like, it was like the secret diary of a Marxist waitress. Basically, when I was working at, like, a cocktail bar at an ice rink, and I was really struggling with my managers, and they used to print, they had this chart on the wall that had the wages all the staff were being paid alongside the profit they were hoping to make. It was really sort of really dystopian and weird. So I wrote about that. I got, and I really enjoyed it. So I think no matter what you're doing, whether, where you're working, you've got really rich seam of stuff to write about. The other great thing to do is is book reviews, film reviews, TV reviews, or even reviewing, like, a photograph or a picture that you see online, or a play or an album or a single or a dance. And I just encourage everyone, like, use your enthusiasm. Like, did you love it? Did you hate it? Is it politically interesting? What is it telling you about society? Is the author or painter or whatever interesting? And why? And I would say as well, like, as an author, like, please do this stuff, like, especially if you love a book. Like, it is so exceptionally helpful to have people write about your book. And if anybody wants a review copy of footwork, what your shoes tell you about globalization, to review for anti-capitalist resistance, let me know and I will send you one, because it's really helpful, and it's a really nice kind of symbiotic relationship. And then, another thing I think that is interesting is talking about sports in relation to ideology and politics. And personally, one of the best things I read it in bed this morning, is a really cool piece. It was by the Guardian, like chief political correspondent, talking about the hypocrisy of Alan Shearer being really mad about Chelsea and Abramovich, and Ukraine, and then being completely silent about Newcastle United, and the flipping journalists chopping up sexist, evil Saudis and their war on Yemen. So, there's like really great things trying to kind of bring sort of social justice, a sense of social justice back into sport, and that kind of thing's always really popular. Then you've got the kind of bigger, more reflective pieces, which are so important, which you can take a longer amount of time on. And these are pieces that deal with deeper arguments about some of the bigger issues that we face as a society. And of course, we have the ecological crisis, the IPCC report that just came out talking about that we're at the point of needing change in order to have a livable planet. There's so much to write about there. Things that interest me at the moment, social media and the commodification of our inner worlds, cancel culture, whether it exists, I think is interesting, online surveillance and privacy, this kind of resurgence of reactionary politics in the wake of COVID. Artificial intelligence is always interesting, like the ongoing debates around gender, masks and disability rights, I think is really interesting. Something that's making me really cross as well is this octopus farm that they want to open, and with octopuses being farmed for meat, when we understand that they are sentient beings, it's basically as close as we'll come to meeting a sort of extraterrestrial life, and they want to farm them for meat. What do these things tell us about the ecological crisis? There's great stuff that you can hook onto things like Valentine's Day or Black Friday and things like that. So any kind of longer, deeper pieces you want to write. And then just quickly, I think profile pieces on historic left figures are always really good, trying to find stuff that is not on Wikipedia and writing about, our Rosa Luxemburgs, our Alexandra Kolontais, our Patrice Lumumbas, people like that, I think is always worth highlighting their work and how is it relevant to now, and what's good or not good about it. Major headlines that catch your attention and you just want to write about it, a comment piece on Partygate, on this octopus farm, on Djokovic not having a vaccination, on fuel poverty, on Prince Andrew, and the less covered bills, like the erosion of our civil rights, the police and crime bill, the erosion of citizenship rights in the UK. There is so much to write about at the moment. Then I guess like more kind of internal work is stuff about what's going on inside ACR and similar currents around the world. So your conference documents, yes, or like internal discussions that are interesting. There's also, I believe, the opportunity to write original poems or short pieces of prose. If non-fiction is more your thing, if you're a poet, or a fiction writer, and I think that is a incredible opportunity to have a website that that will start to publish your work in that sense. So that's really really beautiful thing and beautiful opportunity. And then of course there's the opportunity to write rebuttals or replies or responses to things that other left groups are doing, which maybe you really agree with or maybe you really don't agree with. So issues like Lexit or some of the discussions that are going on at the moment about Noam Chomsky and NATO and so on. So a massive range of things you can write about, from on the ground grassroots reporting to poetry. And yeah, don't forget photography, don't forget video work. Illustrating articles on the internet is so important, and it's a brilliant skill to have.
Thank you, Tanzi. That was excellent. And just a little bit on sort of poetry and fiction and video and photography work. Hopefully we'll do more things like this in the future, and we'll be able to focus specifically on other mediums. I mean, I would love to do something with somebody who knows more about poetry, and I'd have quite a good fiction background on that. So if we have interest in the future, that's something we can definitely consider. Dave, are you ready to come in?
Yes, I think it's all right now.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I mean, that was really great from Tanzi there to get that sort of breadth of art, and that's what we tried to do from the beginning with this site. We had the picture of the week, for example. We encouraged people to write about art and sport, and I think we've done some good work on that. But what the problem is, and why we want this school to be a success, is we do realize we don't have enough younger writers, enough women writers, enough Black and Asian writers. That's the reality, and we want to change that. In other words, we want to make people like me a bit more redundant. We need less articles from me and more from other people, because that's what we, to make a site that's going to make a difference, we need to do that. And as I said before, we want to have more of these schools about videos and podcasts as well, not just about printed word. Anyway, why write? I just put down five points really. First of all, we want to inform people, because we all know that the mainstream media do not report everything. They ignore, as we see today with the Ukraine war. There's a lot of work on that, which we agree there should be coverage of the Ukraine war, but there's also been a very low amount of articles in the mainstream media on Yemen, on Afghanistan, and all these other issues. Secondly, we are not neutral. Our site's not a neutral site. It's not just like, not any of the mainstream media is really neutral, but we don't make any pretense of being neutral. We try and be objective, but not neutral. In other words, we don't just make up stories or exaggerate the truth or twist the truth. We try and use raw evidence and get to the facts, but we do have a point of view. We are trying to win people to anti-capitalist ideas, to ecological ideas. We want to inspire people, in other words. Thirdly, we think they have a role in exposing things, like exposing the ideology we all live under, breaking open the spectacle. I mean, Neil Thornton was brilliant at doing this. Unfortunately, he died recently, we missed him a lot, but he was fantastic at bringing up the issues about our society, how the spectacle works, and to try and look at the language, for example, that faces us all the time. The Labour Party, for example, always talks about the needs of industry, as though it's some sort of neutral thing, not to do with capital or exploitation. It talks, and the mainstream media talks all the time about security, prosperity, respect. What do we mean by these things? Articles that expose this is very important, because people tend to grow up thinking there's no alternative, thinking this is the common sense view of the world. I think we've begun to do this a little bit. The next thing is organizing. It's much easier to do a website that's just a sort of vague current of ideas where you can get people to write for you and they don't really have to take a position on anything. I mean, it's much easier to do that. There's lots of them around. It's much easier. It's a bit more difficult when you're trying to organize, because there is a relationship between our website and the current that we're in, anti-capitalist resistance. So there has to be some connection to that. You can't avoid that. Otherwise, it is just ideas. Having said that, we are in favor of a lot of open discussion debate on our site. We don't just have a party line. I think we consciously try and make our website different to Socialist Worker, Counterfire, or the Socialist Party, which is a very one-line position. And in fact, just to give you an example, I wrote a reply to a piece in Social Worker about the Portuguese elections, which smeared our co-thinkers in Portugal. They claimed that our current Bloco, which is the biggest left group in Portugal, didn't support the truckers' strike and supported the repression of the government. I wrote a piece with facts repudiating that. I had no answer at all for Socialist Worker. They didn't publish anything. That's the sort of quality of journalism you get on some of these sites. And also, these sites tend to be, every article ends with a slogan, the slogan that they always churn out. And you can actually read some of these sites, and it's the same article reproduced the whole time. We're consciously trying not to do that. And finally, we're also involved in educating. We think it's very important that we build a political culture among young people and older people struggling today, because one of the problems today, like compared to maybe in the 70s, is that people have a reluctance sometimes to engage with the idea of revolutionary parties, of even of Marxism and everything else. And in a sense, we need to be able to sort of develop a capacity to take people back to some of the roots ideas of our movement, without forgetting, of course, that these are living things and that we need to develop these ideas with the new insights into ecology, for example, that Marx wasn't able to cover completely for historical reasons, and feminism and anti-racism and all these other issues that we still are examining and understanding. So that's all I wanted to say, really, just to say thanks for everybody coming. It's going to be, looks really interesting. We've got so many people here, and we hope to really do something useful today.
Thank you, Dave. And just noticed Tanzi's put in some links to source protection basics in the chat. So if anyone wants to check those out, they're there. Any questions afterwards, just get in touch with me or somebody else amongst the speakers, and I'm sure we're happy to sort of take questions. Finally, for this part of the workshop, Maya's going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to move on to the next section. So thank you, Maya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm going to try and share my screen because I did some impromptu slides last minute. Hopefully this is going to work. Can everybody see the title slide? Is that, yeah, we're good?
Yeah, working.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start by explaining a little bit about how I got into writing and what I think some of the best sort of motivations are for storytelling for social justice. And then hopefully, if I don't go on too long, there'll be a bit of a chance to hear from some of you guys as well. So I started writing international relations for my local paper when I was 15. There I am. Just to show you, everyone has to start somewhere. I'd never heard of red pepper back then. There was no anti-capitalist resistance where I was living, to put it mildly. But I was very lucky to have something that I would encourage any new writer to go hunting for, because it's vital to our development. And that was a really great editor who mentored me and didn't mind me sticking my head above the parapet, politically, which is not an easy thing to find even still these days. Now the result was quite funny, because sandwiched between, you know, an article on the village fate and, you know, parking fees by the beach, there was my latest piece on Israeli war crimes in the Gaza Strip and coltan mining in Congo. And I got quite a lot of hate mail, which is another thing you can expect from political writing, some of which is still lovingly stuck in a scrapbook somewhere. That's the kind of approach I would encourage people to take. Now, back then, before I got to know what the newspaper industry, the mainstream media industry is like, I, of course, dreamed of being a staff writer at The Guardian, didn't we all? That was going to be me. That's actually Faye Dunaway in a film called Network, which anyone who wants to learn more about how the world of journalism works is a film that I would definitely recommend watching. It's brilliant. It's aged very well since the 70s. But it turned out for me to be the start of quite a different career in storytelling for social justice. I have worked as a freelance journalist, most often writing opinion, because I can't really help myself. As Tanzi was saying, you know, it's a lush area for progressive and radical writing. You can get away often with a bit more within that context. But I've also done most of my writing as a communications officer working for campaign groups and trade unions. This is a much less public kind of writing and storytelling. So it focuses, almost exclusively on amplifying others and supporting them to develop their voice and tell their stories, which is something that is really rewarding. And, doing that kind of work, for example, with migrant workers, with refugees, with human rights defenders from across the global south, I think has produced some of the best writing that I've done in my career. None of it has my name on it, which is an interesting thing, like, to come back to when we think about the question of motivation as well. And as activists, as movement builders who are looking to act in solidarity with those facing oppression, what does that look like when it comes to our writing practice? And it's only in more recent years, actually, that I have been more of a spokesperson as well, writing about myself and my own lived experience. That's not something that I ever thought I would do. And I mention it because, as others have said, I think it's important to emphasize that there are many different ways beyond just traditional news kind of action reporting to do this work and contribute to the very important work of telling the story of our shared movement. And they all matter because stories have enormous power, since, to get super philosophical about it, going all the way back to prehistory. Stories have been one of the most important ways we have created community, connected with each other, created, maintained, but also challenged social norms. One of the most important ways that we preserve knowledge, lessons that we've learned, and share visions of how things might be different one day as well. And turning to modern times, decades of social research have shown us overwhelmingly that political arguments and identities are built mostly in the heart rather than in the head. The other side knows this, the whole edifice of consumer capitalism, advertising, nationalism, the ideology of colonialism, of patriarchy, heteronormativity, all of these systems are built and reinforced through stories. Elections can be won and lost on them. Basically, of course, as a writer, we would say this, right? Stories are everything, and that's why writing, and that's why all of us finding our voices is so important. Before hearing from you guys, I just want to touch on, I think, 3 distinct motivations to write, all of which have been very important for me and are a bit more specific than stories are everything and beautiful and powerful and change the world, although I do stand by that as well. And the first one, perhaps the most simple one, right, which others have touched on already, is to tell the truth. Because the truth matters, even in the fake news era, it does. And if you see a story being told, as we so often do, dishonestly, incompletely, particularly if that's being done to dehumanize or exploit certain people or certain groups, as it so often is, then a desire to challenge that with your own truthful, critical narrative, I think, is an incredible call to write, which if you hear, you should answer. It's why investigative journalism, underfunded as it is, increasingly citizen and activist driven as it is, right, as the mainstream media is disinvesting from that, it's why it's so important. And it always brings to mind for me this fantastic Orwell quote. He could not, I mean, if anyone knew how right he was going to be, it was going to be him, but I still, question whether he ever would have predicted fully 85% of the writing that you see in mainstream news articles today or online, even on The Guardian, is copy and pasted from press releases, right? It's not original reporting. It's copy and pasted from statements, written for people like me in offices that have agendas other than telling the truth. And unfortunately, unlike mine, ours at the IWGB, they're not revolutionary agendas. They get paid 10 times more than we do to work for the bad guys. And so truthful writing that holds power to account has never been more needed than it is right now. I said before, political arguments are won in the heart, and that's, overwhelmingly the case, but it doesn't mean the facts that the truth is not important, simply that they're not enough on their own. They need to be embedded in a good story to have the kind of real world social impact that we write for. I think a second motivation to write is to tell your own story, perhaps the most obvious reason. Now, this is what we would call first person opinion writing, and all your favorite political memoirs, you know, from Emma Goldman to James Baldwin, they all wrote memoir because they knew what a powerful form of political writing this can be. And it's really coming into its own, I think, in the cultural and historical moment that we're in right now. And I love this Baldwin quote, to accept one's past, one's history is not the same thing as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. Because I think it speaks so powerfully to that kind of social function. And when we practice this kind of writing, what might be called lived experience leadership through storytelling, we use our own life as a form of argument for the world that we want to win. And, you know, this kind of nonfiction writing has a bigger audience now than ever before, because I think we are living in a moment of profound polarization, right? In which a lot of people have lost faith in traditional academic expertise that used to carry so much weight, because of course, after decades of being lied to repeatedly by politicians, by scientists, by the so-called experts, there's a natural suspicion of authority to develop, right? And it's why, you know, increasingly we see public responses to interviews, you know, on the evening news with a policy expert, or, you know, another white guy in a suit, has much less impact than hearing from the people, peers who are affected directly by the issue. Increasingly, this is where public trust has shifted. And that's a really important thing to take account of. Now, it has its risks and its drawbacks, but it's also a great opportunity for the left and for revolutionary politics, because it is not the mainstream education or the ideology, the ruling ideology, right, but the lived experience of the majority of people that tells them that the system is rotten. And the last thing I want to say about this kind of motivation in particular is it's not for the faint-hearted. While it can offer us the chance, you know, to take back control of our stories that otherwise might be told about us without us, it can also involve a lot of vulnerability, a lot of emotional labor, and very often quite a bit of backlash. So if you have a story that journalists want, they can be vultures about plundering you for it. And unfortunately, so can a lot of organizations and institutions on the left, this kind of extractive approach to come share your pain, now go away while we talk about the policy and decide what the strategy is to fix the problem. We see a lot of that, right? So if you are interested in writing for this reason, I would just say, you know, work sustainably, center your own well-being, think about what you need to do it in a way that works for you, and try to find people that you trust to do that work with, and feel free to reach out to me as well. I've been developing some resources on this recently that might be useful for you. And very lastly, of course, another great reason to want to write is to build our movement. Now I've run away a bit because I got super into what I was saying, but very briefly, a third reason to write, and I think to start thinking about stories in general, is that they play a really important role in movement building, just like they did, you know, back when we were gathered around the campfire in the beginnings of human society. Stories are still playing a very similar role. I'd really recommend checking out this story of self public narrative model, which was from Marshall Gantz in the United States. It's a really great model for how we can build grassroots leadership through storytelling within movements. It is, of course, about telling and making visible the stories that, you know, we were describing before, particularly telling activist stories, right, which the mainstream media never wants to do. They always want to interview someone who's passively affected by the issue, but God forbid we interview somebody who responded to their lived experience by organizing in their workplace, organizing in their communities, exercising some agency and pushing back. And these are the stories that we really need hear, and supporting others to tell those stories, I think, is also a key part of how we practice democracy within the movement, right? And how we act in solidarity with those facing oppression. Because it's only by sharing our stories while also listening with respect, empathy, and accountability to the stories of those we want to act in solidarity with, that we can build a mass movement that is able to bring in that diversity, that inclusion that was being talked about before as being really important, and that we can start to work across cultures and across identities. You can talk about equality and grassroots leadership until the cows come home, but without that exchange of stories, and that, someone said humility earlier, and I was like, yes, because it's such a key value, I think, to doing this work well. You can't work across difference. We've seen it tried many times before, and it falls apart every time. So yes, in conclusion, this writing, storytelling business, it's not just important for all them out there, the public, the people who are voting Conservative and who we want to educate, whose consciousness we want to raise, and to persuade, to resist and revolt. All of that is really good stuff, and really important, but it's also important for us, right? And we need to learn not just to speak up, but to listen with that humility to others, to help build a stronger movement. And while helping to build a stronger movement, that will also make you a much, much better writer. That's my information. If you want to get in touch afterwards and have any questions about what was just covered. I don't know if I've got any minutes left out of my 10, but if I do, it would be great to hear, if there were any aspects of that kind of resonated with anyone, or if anyone's got any questions.
We're doing great for time, so absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or if there's a particular, like, one of those motivations that we've talked about, that motivated you to come to the workshop today. It'd be interesting to get a sense of kind of where other people are coming from as well.
If somebody wants to ask a quite short question, but nonetheless, just either put up your hand and you can speak. We've got Keval, so if, I'll ask you to unmute and you can ask
I'm also going to stop screen sharing. There we
go. Thanks, Maya, and everyone, for those amazing contributions. And I could pick all of your brains for a very, very long time, but I think Rowan wants us to have a very short question, which is just to go back to number 2, to tell your own story. That resonated really strongly with me. And you said that it has risks and drawbacks. And are those risks and drawbacks the ones that you already mentioned around sort of the vulnerability that comes with that, or are there any others, like political change or movement building? That was the question.
Yeah, there definitely are others. I think the vulnerability part and the emotional labor part, the putting yourself out there part, that's a universal, right? That applies to anybody telling a story that really is close to the bone and that matters to them, and that's part of our lived experience, especially if it's relevant to experiences of oppression or inclusion that we might have, or exclusion that we might have had. There are, of course, there's a spectrum, and it very much depends on who the writer is and what the story is. We deal a lot at work, at the union, with worker whistleblowers who have to speak out anonymously, either because to speak out about the reality of their conditions would lead to them getting fired, or potentially if they have insecure immigration status, right? There's other aspects there in terms of citizenship and having the Home Office coming down on you like a ton of bricks. So it varies, and I think that is why centering on connecting with other writers who have some experience in this area. Again, if this is something you're interested in, please do keep in touch after the workshop, is really helpful. I think pacing is really important. Sometimes it can be, especially for the first time, I can think of a lot of writers who've done a kind of first comment piece for The Guardian that I may have supported them, and I've said, don't look at the comments. There's an assumption that because it's The Guardian, you're not going to get the kind of worst trolling that you see on Twitter, and very unfortunately, like that, yeah, Tanzi's in the background, like that's not how it works. Very unfortunately, that is the case. So just thinking really, carefully about your emotional and intellectual capacity in advance. I encourage all the lived experience writers that I work with to complete a wellbeing plan. I have a little template for that, which I'd be happy to share with anybody who wants it. So this, it's also for both for people who are writing their own stories, but also might be giving interviews to journalists, right? To think in advance about things like, okay, what parts of my story do I want to talk about is really important for me to include, that I don't want to get censored and cut out, but also, are there parts of my story that I don't feel I should have to include and that I'm not comfortable disclosing, and to work out what those boundaries are ahead of time so you don't feel pressured in the moment, in conversation with an editor or in an interview to cross a line that you're not comfortable with. Thinking about sustainability and self-care and all of that stuff is really important. And yeah, I think just doing it in community, not striking out on your own, is something that I would very much encourage, because it can also be really powerful, and some of the responses that I've had to some of the lived experience work that I've done has been, really uplifting and amazing. I've made great new, friendships and political relationships through doing that. And I've also seen, particularly working with refugees and migrant workers, this amazing process of people going from, why would anyone want to hear my story? It's not important. My English isn't good enough. My grammar isn't good enough. Or in the case of talking about experiences of racism, for example, or patriarchy, there's nothing special about my experience. Why would anybody care? And going from that to telling their story, seeing it land, seeing it have impact, seeing it to start important conversations and empower others. And that's a really amazing thing. So it's not all bad, scary stuff. It's also really awesome stuff.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Oh, so just going to admit someone. Thank you. If people have other questions, more generally, the second section will be sort of very interactive, very workshopy. So you will definitely have sort of a chance to speak, and they'll likely take sort of more questions in this session too. Unless somebody has sort of a pressing sort of quick question now, which feel free to put up your hand. We can probably take at least one more. I can move on to the next. Okay, just a bit more. Yeah, okay, that's fine. And if you have questions in the meanwhile, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll sort of keep an eye on that. And if you want to just ask privately, even if there's something you sort of just want to ask just me or another of the contributors, that should be fine as well. So the next bit is going to look at the nuts and bolts of writing, as I said at the beginning, the sort of how to write stuff. So we've reflected on the who, what, and why questions, and the how is what sort of remains. Everybody should have got a copy of George Orwell's quite famous essay on writing via email. Don't worry if you haven't read it yet. That's not a problem. It's just as good to read after the workshop as it is before. And I'll be covering some of the points that Orwell addresses, but going a little beyond that as well, in certain directions that are pertinent to this kind of writing. I'll address this directly now, and then my fellow speakers will in turn look at different examples of writing as we outlined at the beginning, some negative, some positive, to both illustrate and expand on these points in a way that we hope is useful to and hands-on and engaging. But first, I want to assure everyone that I will not be lecturing you on lots of the technical points of grammar, except in one very minor instance. And that's not because this isn't important. It's always good to be honing your prose. To do that work is really important as you develop. But because what I want to focus on now is your ability to structure and well-order sentences to effectively communicate your ideas. Doing so will tend to expand not only on what your writing conveys, but what you are capable of grasping through the process of writing itself. So it's sometimes useful to think of writing as a kind of thinking process itself. You often, and that's why first drafts are really good, but always need revision. You often think through your points through writing. A lot of people, I find writing a very effective sort of thinking tool. However, if you're writing ACR for ACR, your pieces will be copy edited and supported. The idea that every bit of writing has to be written first draft in a completely polished form is what I think prevents most people from being able to put pen to paper in the first place or fingers to keyboard. Extant writing can always be improved. A blank page just simply cannot. Most of what people call writer's block is just anxiety about not being able to pull off a perfect piece from the get-go. Given that I'm not focusing on grammar then, I am instead going to zero in on two fundamentals, as mentioned: structure, encompassing some formatting, and style. It is not enough just to say something, but to get your point across or to convey an event accurately, you need to organize your prose. To do that, you need to consider titles, standfirsts, teasers or leads, paragraph breaks, and subheads as a sort of minimum. If you can be aware of all of those elements, you will already possess a huge advantage in your writing. Each constituent is used not only to communicate in a unique way, but to combine together to guide the reader through your writing so that it is comprehensible, and if done well, helps to make the points more convincing too. So I'm going to take each one very briefly in turn. Titles have always been important. This is the first impression you make, and therefore it is going to act as the principal frame for your article. A good journalistic title has two key jobs. It has to arrest someone's attention, acting as your initial hook, and it has to orientate your reader to arrive at the piece with certain expectations that they're then going to be met. A title has to be punchy and attention-grabbing, but also illuminating. Titles that are just the latter, just illuminating, tend to read like prosaic descriptions of the piece, and I think this is where most people go wrong. So as a sort of fictional title, new welfare cuts or an unjust attack on living conditions, for example, is just too long and too bland. It's not going to grab attention, even if it does give a good sense of what's going on. Whereas titles that are merely attention grabbing, I won't give examples because they would be by their very nature sort of random, are just going to disorientate or confuse readers. So you need to really fulfill both criteria, and I think that's the most important thing to think about in titles. Standfirsts, which might be a new word for some of you, are a succinct summary of the article. They come right after the title, and what they offer is easily understood clarity on what the piece will address. They do not need to be comprehensive, but should highlight the core concern of the article in question. Similarly, your lead is your first few sentences in an article. This should build on the title, and it is in that sense the second hook. When you write this, you need to keep thinking, how do I retain the reader's interest? You've got them in through the title, but you need to make sure they don't just immediately click away. So your first sentence is crucial. It is where you finalize the reader's investment of time in what you have to say. Leads can come in many forms. You can have ones that delve right into the bare facts of the story. Generally, if you are describing events that are themselves shocking or contextually rich. You can lead with an anecdote that nudges your reader into the subject, which can work well if you are telling a story with your article, if it is about a person or a sensitive subject. And you can lead with an observation, taking on a more objective viewpoint, which is effective if you want to comment on something that is in itself broad, such as a social phenomenon, government election, or something like that. Leads should be original and on point rather than rambly or showy rather. Most importantly, do not get too caught on your lead. As much as I've sort of emphasized its importance, you can return to it after you have written your article. Sometimes that's actually a really good thing to do because writing your article will give you ideas. You always want to avoid the sort of dread of the blank page. As a journalist, paragraph breaks are your friend. A paragraph is just a series of related sentences that develop a subtopic, and there's no exact science to it. But for online journalism, the preference generally right now is to make paragraphs short, punchy, to the point. This will help the reader to move quickly through the piece, breaking it up into more digestible parts that do not leave them feeling overwhelmed and anxious as they see large blocks of prose. Sometimes you will need a longer paragraph, however, but always try to limit yourself to 4 or 5 sentences. And it depends on the type of piece as well. In a theoretical piece, there's probably going to be more justification for having more substantive paragraphs. Moreover, it is good to alternate the lengths of your paragraphs. So the variation itself helps the reader, stopping the piece from becoming too monotonous. And that this is actually just as true for sentence length as well. If every sentence is the exact same length, it builds up this feeling of dry repetition. So that's something to generally avoid. It is also, of course, a way to signal a change in register on a topic. So a longer paragraph within an article with lots of short paragraphs shows that this is the meat of the article. This is where something requires a little while to tease out and deserves, according to you as an author, that extra time. And it signals all of this quite subtly to the reader. Subheadings, like the title, help to frame the piece. They are sort of titles internal to the piece itself. They help break up sections within the article, especially for longer pieces, and are usually 3 to 5 word descriptions about what this is going to address. They don't really have to be as attention grabbing as titles, although they don't want to be too sort of ugly and sort of lumped in their describing something. They're also a bit like paragraph breaks in that they compartmentalize the overall piece into a more manageable and comprehensive chunks. They are like signposts in a way. This is where I'll discuss X, this is where I'll discuss Y. Again, there's no exact science as to how many you need. It will depend on the number of distinct subjects the article addresses, as much as the overall length of the piece. But when you feel there is a shift in the article's focus, they are usually a good way to signal this to your reader. As well as how to structure an article, it is important that it is itself written to engage and excite your reader. When it comes to style and structure, however, there is an overlapping consideration, and that's tangents and discontinuities. These are both a stylistic error and they are a structural problem. When writing, try not to get hopelessly lost in tangential arguments or anecdotes that do not serve the article's conclusions or overall point. Always ask, what is the thing I'm contributing to this piece with this addition? Be willing to cut even good writing if it is not serving the article as a whole. Moreover, even if a piece is relevant, don't just jump from point to point. As a writer, you need to join up your arguments to guide your reader from one issue to the next. Consider and make clear the connections between everything that you introduce, and again, use subheadings to signpost. So that's the basic structure of an article. If you keep those things in mind, as I say, you will always have a huge advantage. Orwell also has 6 rules that I think are really useful, and they're to be generally absorbed, with emphasis, as Orwell does note in his final rule, on generally. These are: avoid cliches, use short words, cut whatever you can, use the active, not the passive voice, avoid jargon, foreign words, scientific terms, and break the rules whenever necessary. Most of those are self-explanatory, but it is worth pausing on 2 of them quickly, and particularly on the active voice. Now, the active voice is when the subject, the person or thing being described, performs the action of a verb, a word describing an action, state, or occurrence. A passive voice is just the opposite. That is when the subject does not perform the action of a verb. So to just give a really quick example, Joe Biden won the 2020 United States presidential election is in the active voice because Biden is the subject and he performs the verb won. Whereas the winner of the 2020 United States presidential election was Joe Biden is in the passive voice because the subject does not perform the verb, the active voice. Now, the active voice is better because it's engaging and pithier. It's not something you have to obsess over, but it is just good to have that in the background. If you want sort of more illumination on this, there's loads of good stuff on Google. Grammar is excellently served by web searches, I always generally find, and there's fantastic range of resources in terms of sort of basic introductions to those kinds of concerns. Cliches, I want to pause on because I think it's such an important error, and it's a very common one for the obvious reason. These are the ready-to-hand stock phrases or tired, repetitive ideas and arguments that, rather than engage with thought, put it to sleep. Stylistically, cliches deaden language. They are familiar and therefore boring. In terms of content, though, they are even worse than that. They appeal to conservatism that seeks to comfort rather than confront, and confirms prejudice rather than interrogates it. And we all use cliches. It's unavoidable to some limited extent that there are going to be cliches that kind of sink into your writing, but it is always worth being conscious of that and trying to avoid them whenever possible. As well as rules, Orwell suggests 6 questions for the writer to ask themselves. And I think these are also really, really merited. What am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image or idiom will make it clearer? Is this image fresh enough to have an effect? Could I put it more shortly? Have I said anything that is avoidably ugly? The first three are excellent questions to ask before you write your first draft. The last three are obviously more useful to consider in your revision, but it's good to have these kinds of shorthands to hand and to consider not too much by rote, but in a generalized way and when appropriate. When you produce an article, you're going to be writing in different modes. One mode is reportage. That is where you convey report about things in the world. The other is commentary, where you make sense of the things and offer your interpretation of them. Delineating between the two makes it clear of the need to integrate them where they both sort of coexist. It is easy, but not too useful to have a piece that just describes things without saying anything about what is being described or supplying any context. Equally, it is easy to rant about your opinions on something without grounding what you are saying in the world, without presenting evidence. So it's really good to be conscious of the need to balance these things. If you've got something that you're presenting to somebody, interpret it, offer some clues about it. Don't just sort of leave it hanging. Similarly, don't sort of just disappear into completely abstract, ungrounded tangents that offer people really very little reason to even trust what you're saying. When you write, you might draw on first-hand experience that's already been mentioned as a really good way to approach writing an article. For example, if you report back from a demonstration, which was an example given earlier, you will also likely want to add quotes as well as have that kind of first-hand experience. And either these two sources really require you to think about how you contextualize them in the piece as a whole. So experiences are a great way to set out the scene, to provide context for a point you're going to make. And for them, you really need to use rich sensory language when describing an event, even if it will be, since it will be more powerful and evocative for your readers. With quotes, you need to treat people's words carefully. This has already been touched on quite a lot, so I'll just be very quick on this. But communicate who your speaker is, either their name and something relevant, or if they're anonymous, as Tanzi has mentioned, they might need to be, give some useful context about them, but obviously very carefully so you don't end up betraying them. Do not rely on the quote to do the task of the article, however. This is, I think, a really important point, especially if you're just coming at this. It's very tempting if a quote, for example, makes your argument for you to just leave it at that. But you still need to summarize the argument before or after the quote. You need to integrate the point into your article itself. Always be careful not to quote mine as well. I think this is a really important and often overlooked point. Quote mining is when you use a partial quote in such a way that misleads the reader about the meaning of the person being quoted. This can happen often accidentally. You find something, you've got a snippet of it, it's perfect for your piece, so you just really go for it. And it can happen, especially, I think, when you're unsympathetic to the quoted person, although sometimes even when you're sympathetic to them, if it's a really nice, pithy line that, just fits. But it's generally unethical and misleading, and it's unhelpful in the long term to do that. So it's always good to think about quote mining as something to carefully avoid. It has already been said, but it is worthwhile repeating. Above all, say what you mean as clearly, as simply, and as concisely as you can. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments, and we can also deal with some of the more technical things later on when we do the workshopping process. Thank you. And I think now we're ready to move on to the good and bad writing sections, which let me just find my outline, which is going to start with Dave. So these are going to be just short sections where we look at examples. So Dave, do you want to?
Yes, I was going to look at the Robert Fisk piece, which I have on my screen. They share my screen. Hang on. Here it is. Can everybody see it? Hello? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
This is the piece I chose, which I think is a really brilliant piece. It's a very short piece, and it's easy to cover. I hope everybody's read it. And it's just fantastic because what it does is it's got a basic political point, which we all obviously agree with, that the Palestinians have been removed from their land and forced into exile, and they still want to go home. They demand to go home. That's the basic political point he's getting over. But obviously, he does this in an extraordinary way because he uses the image of the key in the alcove, in the handkerchief from the old lady, and you get a full emotional sense of what's happened to this people. Because you could have just written an article about the expulsion of the. And what's good about this article is that the image goes all the way through the article like a thread. And this is quite a good technique, I think, when you write an article where you come back to at the end, because through the article ties the thing together. And what's great about this is you really feel you're there. He puts you in the room with the key, the little details, the gunmetal, the rust, the sharp, all that's really brilliant, I think. The other thing he does, which is very useful, I think, is he uses questions. I think questions are good in articles. Obviously, you can overdo questions, but I think a few questions are very good in articles because it engages directly with the reader. It forces the reader to think about what they're reading. And then what's really good about this article, the last paragraph takes the link to Israel, where their homes are. And he says, you can actually go and see these homes. And in a way, this is brilliant because it cuts through all the complexities and the difficulties which the mainstream media and all the people who don't want to do anything always raise about the Palestinian question. Oh, it's all very complicated. But what he says, the real issue is this. These people have lost their homes, and you can go and check. You can see they've lost their homes because in Israel, you can go and see the homes. They're still standing, and you can actually touch them. I think this is really very good. And the very last few words in this text, when it says, who would open them? I mean, that's brilliant because it just poses the whole question about somebody else has taken those homes. No, it's a political question. It's a political system that has meant that those doors are not opened by the people who they belong to. I think that's really very good. So I just think this is a good way, and I think what's good about it is it's very succinct. It doesn't waste words. In a short piece, it gets over a lot. And I think when you're writing a political article, if you can, it's good to try and find an image. This doesn't have to be you being in the place. It could be something you take off the television, a photo, or some statement that somebody's made that you found in another media. I think you can do that and work up from that. For example, Boris Johnson's a great mine of this sort of stuff because he's so much of his personality and his character reflects his politics. So it's quite easy to pick things he's done or things he said and say, this shows this, yeah? And I think the same thing with Ukraine at the moment. There's an incredible amount of images available. In fact, that's possibly one of the reasons why the Russians aren't killing more people, because there's so much media available through smartphones and everything else, that it's not like in Chechnya where there wasn't on the spot media phones everywhere, smartphones showing people what was happening. So there's a huge amount of stuff there. I mean, one that sticks in my mind a lot, the images of people walking towards tanks. You can build a whole article around that sort of thing. So I think bringing them really into our articles is very good. And using certain color, certain details is very important as well. And using a thread again. And what I think is good about this article, Fisk's article, I don't always agree with Fisk actually on his opinions, but this article is brilliant because there's a voice there, and Fisk was always good at bringing his voice. And I think one of the secrets of good writing is to find a voice and to express that voice. I think the other comments before, I think, made this point as well. Okay, that's. Do you want me to do the second point, or do you want to pass on to somebody else? I've got another piece, the Hemingway piece, to look at.
Either way is happy. If you would like to sort of alternate, that definitely works. So let me just see who's next. So Tanzi, do you want to come in with a piece?
Okay, mine are a couplet, so I want mine to go together. But so I am going to try and play. So the theme of what I want to talk about with my two pieces, the common thread is like using the life of one person to tell the story of a nation and of a geopolitical situation. And the two ones that I picked were the Intifada and the financial crash, and the way people have been picked to tell these stories, but without laboring the point of the thing. So, but first of all, I want to share a 1 minute video, which is basically how not to report on people. And I don't know if people used to watch any of these programs in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, where they used to, report on people in this way. So this is like very much, this is a parody. This is like how not to report and talk about people.
You might think the scum society.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You might think the scum society live here, in the gutter. But due to mass benefit fraud, they actually live here, in mansions. To make matters worse, they're not only poor, they're fat.
How many kids is too many? 1, 2, 3? Well, this lady has 4. This man might think he's a woman, but we just think he's weird.
We've all seen rappers with their big gold watches, but how are they paying for it? You guessed it. Benefit!
This is what Derek eats in 1 week.
I'm pretending to be poor for science.
I'm deep undercover as a homeless man.
I'm in the park giving out ASBOs to the ugliest teenagers I can find.
I'm here in front of the British Communist Party's headquarters. And guess what? They're all gay.
Luckily for me, I don't live here.
We've trapped this fat man's family inside a block of butter.
The old nursery rhyme goes head, shoulders, knees and toes. But what if I told you there's a family who have none of them?
Okay, how do stop sharing? Okay, so that's like the perfect 1 minute guide on what not to do, courtesy of the BBC and Panorama and ITV for for a good couple of decades. So I don't know if anybody has anybody had a chance to read any of the pieces that I sent over. So there's one by Amira Hass and one by Jess Bruder, and they're both kind of longer form pieces. I just wondered if there was anything anybody wanted to say before I start, if anyone had any comments or had noted anything. If anyone wants to put anything in the chat or but yeah, so I'll just keep going, and if anyone thinks of anything or throughout the time, if anyone wants to say anything. So I think the beauty of both of these pieces is the way one person's life story has been used to tell a bigger story. And in one case it's the story of Palestine and the Intifada, and in the second case it's the story of the 2007-8 financial crash in the United States. And one thing I think both of these journalists do really, really beautifully is they tell the story of like people and their problems rather than problems and their people, which I think is a really important distinction. And so let's look at Amira Hass first of all, and she's introducing us to Abu Majed, and the details in this piece are both quite sparse, but they're both really, really rich. So she talks about a thin mattress. They're sitting on a thin mattress in this room, and the way it's like it's the only furniture in that room. And within half a line, like you are in that room with them. And the whole of the piece, I think you really feel the investment of Amira's time in this piece. Like, she has clearly spent a lot of time getting to know this person. She's, getting to know his life and his situation, visiting in his home. And I think you can really, you really sense that. You really feel that investment. And there's a great deal of humanity in this piece, where she's describing him and his situation and what it's like in Gaza. And I think there's a really interesting thing that she does, similar to what David was just talking about, is like showing life through something quite commonplace. And in the last piece about Palestine, it was a key, and in this piece, it's a pepper. And it's this pepper, which is something that is like so relatable, like a favored food already puts you sort of in mind of this person and on the side of this person. And I think the other thing that's really good about this piece is the pacing of it, where she has the courage to hold back this sort of punchline about Gaza being a giant prison, and this explanation of what the joke is, and that the only thing that's missing is the roll call. And whilst this is part of a longer book, I think this is something that you can do in articles as well. So sort of seeing the article as a holistic thing, where there's a thread that runs through it. So the peppers and the prison runs the whole way through it. I wanted to just pull up something here about one bit of this writing that I am cautious about, and I would encourage you to be cautious about as well, which is the bit in there where she says, where is it? She says, I imagine him. She says, I can see him, a skinny boy mixing cement in Beersheba or hauling crates in Tel Aviv. And this is an interesting thing that she's done here, because I believe that a lot of it is based on the time that she spent with this man. But I think there is a tension between a journalist kind of saying, like, doing this imagining on behalf of this person. And I think sometimes it's better if you don't know these things about them, then, either you interview them and you find out about it, or you don't kind of put in stuff that you potentially have imagined. I think there's a bit of a dilemma, because, we don't know. For example, she talks about, oh, maybe he's glancing at women in Tel Aviv, but like, we don't know if he's even interested in women or glancing at women at all, or, or is that just something that she thinks that he might have been doing. So I think we shouldn't, don't impose our stuff on here. But also, the other thing that it really reminded me of is the way that she's taken this one person and these experiences that he's had of being a casual laborer, of being a political prisoner, and she, and using him to talk about how Gaza has become this giant prison is really interesting. And it reminded me of like two quotes from other writers, actually. And the first of which is a Joan Didion quote. And she wrote this amazing piece. She covered like a murder trial in California, which is called Some Dreamers of the Golden Dream. And she says in that, there's a line that I always really like, where she just, it's a wife who was accused of murdering a husband. And she just says, unhappy marriages so resemble one another that we do not need to know too much about the course of this one. That she's writing about. And it's like a real light touch, where she trusts you to understand what it means to be unhappy, to be in an unhappy relationship. She doesn't need to like explain everything to you. And I think that's something that Amira also does really beautifully in this piece. But on the flip side, you have Tolstoy, who in Anna Karenina said, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So I think at the same time, like if you feel like you need to explain some of these details and explain why someone in particular was unhappy, why was somebody in a homeless shelter like unhappy, or somebody at a food bank or whatever, then actually, there is a great deal of importance of explaining either way. So the next piece I wanted to talk about is Jess Bruder's piece. And so Jess Bruder is the author of Nomadland. I don't know if anyone here has like either seen the film or read the book. Like the book is amazing. I read the book in a weekend. The film is good, but is definitely less good. It fudges quite a few of the issues, but the book, my God, it's incredible. And what I love about this is, again, there's a really light touch, a real light touch in this piece. And this is the article she wrote in 2017. And then went on to go and then spend 3 years researching this and living in a van a lot of the time herself. And she's describing a couple's descent from a very comfortable middle class existence down to living in a van. And there's no need for adverbs in this piece. There's no like, oh, sadly this happened, or unfortunately this happened. She just very factually tells you the story, which is something I really admire. And again, as David has mentioned, as I mentioned with the pepper, she's writing about people a lot through their stuff, which I think is very relatable. And it's a piece that's very centered in the material. It's what they owned before the crash, a house in a gated community on a golf course. They had 2 pianos, and now they are down to an RV and like 2 cans of beans. And it really beautifully shows us the precarity both of growing up poor and of this middle class existence. And the other thing I just think she does extraordinarily well is just imbibe this whole article with fear, without ever using the word fear. And she humanizes this fear of sickness and of hunger, but without using the word, without saying, oh, Bab was like very scared of getting sick, or Chuck was hungry. She just drops in these details, so it becomes palpable. She says they had no health insurance. They said, they were down to $8. They had 2 cans of beans, and you immediately know what's coming down the line for these people. And I think two last things I wanted to talk about here are like some of the things for how to be sensitive when you're writing about people, and particularly when you're writing about people in their most vulnerable moments, which is certainly what Jess Bruder is doing when she's meeting this couple in their RV. First of all, I think because Maya's talked a lot about how some people want to do first-hand reporting and write about their own lived experiences, but if you do want to do more like reporting about other people, and if you do get the privilege for people to share their story with you, I think it's really important that you think a lot about how you write those stories, because you often, if somebody lets you into their life, if you're given the honor of being let into somebody's life and into somebody's home, then you will see things that you could write about, and additionally things that might even like help the story. So like a completely fictitious example that I came up with this morning to try and illustrate this is like, say you get to interview like a strike leader, and who's being facing, who's been sacked or whatever, and they let you go to their house, and their house is in like total disarray, like there's piles of laundry, the washing up hasn't been done for 3 weeks, and you sort of think, oh wow, this is like an amazing illustration of the pressure this person is under, and the fact they've got no time because they're spending 18 hours a day organizing, and I should definitely like put in here like that their house is like a complete tip, and stuff. And I just think you need to think about how you would sound writing those kinds of things, and you don't want to sort of engage in like gossip about people, and you want to kind of think about how would it feel if you were telling somebody this story, and would they think, like Tanzi was actually just really horrible about this person that she'd met, and she was like cussing them over their house and everything. And I think it's exactly the same kind of thing when you're writing. Like you have a duty to your interviewees in the same way that Jess had, in the same way that Amira had. You know, you can point out things like a mattress is the only thing in the room, but you don't want to sound spiteful and horrible when you're talking about people. And the other thing I think is really important, and this is a really great piece of advice that I got from a writing teacher, American writing teacher called Mark Kramer, who's written some fantastic books about journalism and long form journalism. And his really simple advice is just like, write as if you are talking to your neighbor over the garden fence. You know, say you've gone to cover like a house fire. You know, are you going to write that article like a police report? You know, at 3:37 a.m. Suspect seen fleeing the scene. You know, fire raged through three stories, 8 fire engines, 17 fire fighters. You know, damage worth whatever. Like, you know, or are you going to write it like, you know, we're having a chat now? So there was a fire, like, you know, I've not super good at just sort of spieling this stuff off, but you know, there were, you know, like, oh, it was really frightening. There was a fire. There was a man who we think set the fire, and he, you know, like having a psychotic episode, and the police came, and you know, and just really sort of humanizing it. You know, and nor do you want to sort of write this article as if it was like a polemic speech either, but you just want to, like, you know, do it gently, do a light touch, write as if you're talking to people, and remember that you are talking to people, and so, you know, you've got to be kind in your writing, and you've got to, you know, make people want to read it as well. Yeah, so sorry if I went over a little bit, but I'm yeah, very happy to answer any questions, or if people had thoughts, if there was stuff about those 2 pieces that they liked or didn't like, or any questions.
No worries at all. We're still doing great for time, so there's it should be fine. Maya, I missed the fact, but you've got your hand up, so I wondered if you had a. No, that's okay.
No. Sorry. I mean, don't feel bad that you missed me. I was riveted. I really want a copy of this video because I think that was brilliant. I have a question, because I also think these stories that are like, you know, going with a human story is such a good way into an accessible and powerful way into dealing with some of the big, you know, structural issues that the 2 pieces you gave kind of contextualized and we're referring to. There's a tension there, isn't there, between, you know, the power of telling a story that tells 100 stories in one, and also telling it in such a way that it makes that singular experience look representative of something that is, you know, involves a multiplicity and a diversity of experience. Do you have any advice for people who are starting to write like this, in this vein, for how to navigate that and how to get the balance right? Because I think very often when those pieces don't hit the mark politically, like that's the reason, right? And then you can end up having an impact with the work that is opposite to what you had intended.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, let me know if I've not understood the question correctly, but I think like a good sort of starting point for doing this kind of story is when, like, and a sort of easy way is when there's like some documented evidence that there is a problem. So for example, maybe like a report has come out about something, for example, like fuel poverty, and there's some hard statistics about that, and the number of people, you know, who are maybe having to choose between food and fuel, and then you've got that as your base, and you can be like, there definitely is this problem, and then you could, you know, find your interviewee, your person who's living with this issue. I would say, yeah, is a good place to start. And then certainly with someone, well, with both Amira Hass and Jess Bruder, like they were, I mean, Jess Bruder spent 3 years like meeting hundreds of people who were also like in advanced years and living in vans. So she knew that it was, and she, you know, and that was something that, like, in her case, we didn't know, or it wasn't known to be like a massive problem, and she presented it as a problem. So yeah, more time, more effort, and certainly, yeah. And again, with Amira, like, she's spent decades reporting on Palestine, so she had the authority to, I think, to use that.
Thank you. I'm going. Oh, okay. I'm going to take the question in the chat because I was just asked by Simon too first. So Penny asks, the flip side of being respectful and kind about people you're writing about is maybe buying into their story too much and not being sufficiently critical. I've had this trouble in the past where I took the subject at face value. Do you have any hints about how to avoid that problem?
Yeah, I mean, so is this an interviewee that told you something that turned out like not to be true?
No, this was like a profile of an artist, of a painter. And I guess the feedback I got from the piece was that it was just too kind of, not gushing, but, you know, I didn't really engage critically enough. It was just, I suppose it maybe sounded more like PR or something. That was the situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's really like that's really difficult, difficult situation to cut, like, but I guess it depends what kind of article you were trying to write. Like, if it was like a review piece, then I think you are in your right to be, you know, to be really really sort of emphatic in your enjoyment of that person and their work. So I think, yeah, I suppose if it was like supposed to be more of a kind of objective, like, profile piece, then maybe you could, I mean, if, for example, if you were doing that like on a politician or something, then you would want to get like some people who didn't necessarily agree with them in there for balance and some context. I would say, and I mean, with that, in a broader situation, I guess, yeah, there will always be people who will tell you things that aren't true. So the importance of like fact checking can't be overstated as well. I mean, you know, like a famous thing that, well, if anyone's watching Inventing Anna or what has watched it, like the journalist in that got caught out by a young guy who said he'd made like $250,000 on the stock market, and then like or something like that, and like none of it happened to be true. So, you know, then in that kind of situation, you can ask for evidence. If somebody's saying that they do a certain job, you can ask for their ID card. You can ask for identification letters from the job or the bank or whatever. But likelihood is with these sort of stories around like fuel poverty or the energy crisis and stuff, and if you're meeting people in their homes or talking to people, then likelihood is you can take them at face value. I think, the other thing that's always good to just question is like, what's this person's motive for talking to me? That's like a really good thing just to always have in mind. Like, do they have an ulterior motive? Is a really good way of like assessing whether you should trust a source or a person.
Just with a little mind to the clock now. Simon, Maya has her hand up now. Do you want to sort of ask two questions in one? So Simon, do you want to ask a question really quickly?
It was a really quick question. So the old adage for writing a novel was write what you know or what you've experienced. Do you think that a writer today can write about anything, or is it still important to have that lived experience of the subject matter?
No, I think well, like as a journalist, personally, I think anybody can write about anything. Like, I think that is literally the job. Certainly, if I just wrote about my lived experience, it would be a very boring blog about, So yeah, no, I think that is the job. I think that's the job, is to be accurate, and to be fair, and to be like as objective as you can, and to give, really, like, to give people a platform, as well, because I think, like, a lot of the people that I write about, like, they're like, for example, like garment workers, in a factory in Bangladesh, like, they're not in the immediate position to be able to write about what's happening to them, or people who are under fire from the generals in Myanmar. I don't have the time to write about what's happening to them at the moment. So no, I think you should look. I think it's really important, frankly, to look beyond your own lived experience, when you're looking at what you want to write about. Like completely vital. Like, think really globally.
Just to quickly answer a question in the chat. Yeah, I left it open to the speakers to pick good or bad examples. So if they decide that sort of just all good examples are better to illustrate their points, then that's sort of at their discretion. And I think that's fine. I mean, I think sometimes you can learn a lot from bad examples, but sometimes just having good examples is sufficient to convey everything you need to. So I'll take Maya's question, and then Maya, you can after an answer, you can probably just go right on and give your examples, and then we'll finish with Dave.
Sure, I don't mind eating into my time with this, because I think it's a really good, these are really good and important conversations to have. I really agree with what Tanzi just said about writing beyond your lived experience as a journalist. I think it's just about being mindful about, how you navigate the power dynamics there, especially coming from our kind of like shared political tradition. Obviously, we all understand why that's so important. And, as a way of protecting yourself and the integrity of your work, and the reliability of your work, and the trusting relationships that hopefully you will build with editors over time, as you work on different stories, making sure that you are not making factual claims, not to be confused with opinions now, but not to be making factual claims that you can't back up with, and the importance of asking for evidence, and that there being a way to do that, right? So especially if you are speaking to somebody who is in the midst of struggle, or is talking about their experiences of oppression or exploitation, it can feel quite scary to ask somebody to prove what they're saying, and we can feel very nervous and awkward about that. And there are really good reasons why we should feel sensitive about how that might be interpreted and how that might make the other person feel. And I think it's just about being clear about what your motivation is for writing the story, as well as the other person's motivation for talking to you. So when I have to have those tricky conversations with people, very often you're couching it in terms of not can you show me this document or whatever because I don't believe you. It's, can you show me this document because that gives me the ability to tell your story more forcefully, more powerfully, in the published article, because I can say that, because we can say that we've seen it. There are by trusting that. I think it's about having trust and respect for the interviewee very often, and seeing them as a participant, in a collaborator in the story that you're creating together, rather than this kind of the journalist is the active and the interviewee is the passive one. And I think if you kind of come at it from that sort of approach, it makes all of these conversations a lot easier, and the whole thing a lot more empowering and valuable for everyone. And on the subject of empowering everyone, I'm gonna just share my screen quickly. Yeah, so this is the first article that I wanted to share today, because it's a good example of what I was talking about before. The author who wrote this article, it was the first article she had ever written in English, and it was published in the Guardian newspaper. Again, this was with support from an interpreter, from Editorial, but I think it's a really good example of a lot of the you know, those golden rules, that those 8 what are they called, the 8 rules for political writing in the English language, the Orwell piece, which is just such useful guidance and has been stuck up above my writing desk for like 10 years. You can see I think there's an interesting kind of like use of 2 different things at the top here, because the byline, kind of both the one written by the editor at the top, but also this first paragraph here: I clean the hallways of one of the richest universities in the world, but last year when I was recovering from surgery, my family was the only thing standing between me and homelessness. This is a really powerful example of life as argument, right? And it's also a really good, powerful example of, you know, it's telling you everything you need to know really about the context within the very, very first sentence. We have a sense of what the argument's going to be, we have a sense of how it's going to be made, and we have a sense of a really strong sense of voice, right, of who's speaking to us. And with that confidence and voice, at the same time, I also really like the what she chose as the title, because it's an open question, and that's something that we haven't talked about very much today, but I think is a very useful journalistic tool. Like when we talk about interviewees and even readers, actually, I think it's helpful to think of everyone who's involved in every stage, including the reader, as an active participant, right, rather than just a passive one. And you know, opening this with a question, I think, sets a very different tone, and means that the very strong personal story and the very strong like political statements that come later land very differently. Does anyone want to hazard a guess as what the answer to that question might be, or perhaps what might be an important difference between the directly employed staff at UCL at this time and outsourced workers like Leah, who wrote this article? Feel free to just shout out or put something in the chat what might have been an important difference. Anyone?
Majority of the workers were probably migrant workers.
Yeah, exactly. Got it in one.
Women.
Yeah, overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly non-English speaking migrant workers. And I think having that answer come up in your mind first before you start reading the article, rather than having, you know, being hit over the head with it from the outset, I think is really key. Just to scroll down a little bit as well. So when we think about these kinds of interviews, and you know, Tanzi was talking with the first example of a kind of article that you can write, was going down to the picket line, right, and reporting what you see. This is another example, I think, closer to the articles that were shared before, of the one story that, you know, tells the story of many of her peers and colleagues, at the same time, while being very personal, right? And this kind of storytelling is not something that you see very often in newspapers like The Guardian, in the sense that you know, the kind of liberal, more progressive media outlets are really good with these powerful personal stories, but what they tend to not like to do so much is embed those in collective struggle. And it brings us back to another one of the purposes of writing that we were talking about before, right, which is writing for movement building, or writing as a means to recruit. It's always been a fight that we've had to have even the name of our union included in an article, even when the whole thing is written by a member of that union about a collective worker struggle that they are participating in as a union. I mean, it is the heart of the story, and very, very often, you know, even something like the organization name gets pulled out. And this is one of the reasons why, you know, I think these kinds of personal stories and this kind of activist approach to reporting is so important, because otherwise our shared history of, you know, all the amazing campaigns, all the really important work that's going on it ends up being an isolated collection of individual stories. And of course, that's not what's actually happening. There's a huge amount of like collaboration and organizing and hard work and collective decision making that underpins stories like this. And I think this is it's a good example of an article that has kept that clarity and kept that kind of honesty. The other thing that I want to draw attention to here, let me just find the right paragraph. Where is it? Yes. So what also I think these stories can do very powerfully is lead by example. So at the time when this campaign, at the time when this article was being written, you know, it was an interesting moment for this campaign, because workers like Leah were you know, going for, you know, we want sick pay, we want holiday pay, we want basic living wage. Then you had the academic staff who, as we were saying, you know, mostly British citizens, overwhelmingly much more male, much more white, who were also fighting a defensive battle against attacks on their pay and conditions, but their pay and conditions were much higher. And I think what stories like this can do really well is, you know, refuse to push readers into a position where you're choosing, you know, one struggle is worth talking about and the other one isn't, and because one is more extreme, basically, that's the story. And I think by, you know, Leah made a very deliberate decision to include this as part of one struggle and reframe politically, you know, it's not about migrant workers versus staff, it's not about BME workers versus white workers. This is about, you know, the privatization of the education system, and that kind of political clarity that comes through, I think really well alongside her personal story here, is really effective. And then the last thing I just want to highlight right at the end here. So again, thinking about the kind of voices that we're bringing in, how many articles have you read by 42-year-old single mums who work as janitors? Like, we don't see these kinds of stories anywhere near often enough. And unfortunately, like, even The Guardian, even you know, even allied movement outlets are no exception, to this rule. And I think this article is a really good example of how powerful that can be when there's a support structure in place to enable it to happen. And also coming back to the journalistic stuff that Rowan was speaking to earlier, the importance of timing, right? Finding a good hook, thinking strategically about how and when we tell these stories, and how, you know, that strategic approach can support campaigns. I just love this little casual line at the end. On the day this article was published, UCL contacted The Guardian to say, and this was the first time that they had announced this, by the way, after 10 years of campaigning, that the university had committed to equalising pay and benefits for its outsourced staff. This followed months of foot dragging, where it was kind of like considered to be a foregone conclusion, but the announcement wasn't coming. And of course, every week people were still going to work under the same conditions, with the same precarity, the same lack of basic worker rights. And you know, I will never be convinced that it's coincidence that you know, I love to think about the the response the Chancellor would have had when he came in to the office for his morning coffee with his croissant or whatever, and as these, you know, liberal artsy types I want to do, like, go to his laptop and open The Guardian, and there is an article written by one of his cleaners about the exploitation that they were facing at that university. And I just realized I've gotten so into this, totally run out of time for the other one. But very briefly, in like 2 minutes, the reason why I like this one is I think it speaks to that 8th rule of Orwell, right? Feel free to break any of the rules if the story calls for it. And this is a great example of that, because it is very long. It is conceptually quite complicated, right? So she's speaking about she's speaking to imperialism here. She's speaking across Russia and the United States and Canada, all these countries, different respective colonial histories, what they have in common. She's putting it in a new framework. So, like, you know, she's setting this up as saying, not in the traditional way we talk about geopolitical relations, but it's actually quite, you know, It's a new framework. She's talking about, you know, what's the shared relationship between how we think about time and, you know, this kind of resurgent return to the valorization of empire. That's a very like original framework, but it also I think really taps into something that's very relevant. Like we've been talking, I don't know who else is like mostly watching Netflix shows that they've already watched now. Apparently this is like a very common like collective anxiety response to like COVID and World War III and everything that's going on, that there's a generalized non-politically specific thing with nostalgia right now. And I think what Naomi Klein is kind of very good at and very known for is, I was at a book launch earlier this week for Patrice Kalor's new book on abolition, and she was talking about this as well, the difference between reacting and responding, and that, you know, particularly within journalism and particularly within social media, there's this thing of, you know, as soon as something comes out, we all have to be saying something really snappy and really like feisty and really like fierce about it one way or the other. The bit of editorial response that was mentioned before, you know, my review wasn't critical enough, I didn't have anything nasty to say. That's another really good like example of this, right? That you can deal with all the time in the mainstream media. And, you know, I think pieces like this that reflect an ability to really slow down and think at a deeper level about, you know, how to tell stories and what we're observing in the world, I guess, and taking the time to allow yourself to take the time to slow down and be patient and think, okay, what is it that I want to say that hasn't already been said, is really valuable. And I had more, but I'm going to stop there because I'm 2 minutes over time. Thanks.
Thank you. And don't worry, it's really interesting. And I think an example that illustrates that last rule of Orwell is really good, because having sort of these things become sort of clubs with which we used to beat ourselves is always a danger with these kinds of rules. Dave, do you want to finish off with your last piece, or we could? Sorry, you're muted.
Perhaps there's not a lot of time. I thought I did it. A person in something in the, I think I'd say it'd be bad writing. I have a piece on Hemingway which I think you can look at, and I've annotated it. But I think that it's maybe more important to address the bad writing thing. I think in terms of political bad writing, or any bad writing, it's where it's difficult to read. I mean, if you've got long sentences and long paragraphs, it's harder to read. That's why we always, on the site, encourage our writers to cut their texts into shorter paragraphs. Not in an exaggerated way. I mean, some of the left press, I think Social Work is a good example, every paragraph sort of 4 lines. You don't need to go as absurd as that, but you do need to cut down your paragraphs so they're not too long. Long sentences are the same, and Rowan talked about passive sentences, you know, where it's something being done to something else, which is always more complicated to understand. In other words, if you're reading a sentence, you're struggling to work out what the sentence is, you've lost the reader. Yeah. I mean, the other bad writing is sloganizing, where it's just easy slogans that you've read 100 times before, which doesn't really help explain or deepen anything. Another sort of feature of bad writing, I think, is where it's difficult to identify a voice behind the person writing it. It's just very bland and dry and over objective, if you see what I mean. I mean, some articles obviously lend itself more to that than others. Obviously, if you're doing a political statement from the ACR or from RS21 or something, obviously it's not going to be personal in that sense. So it's a different sort of writing. Although I think even with those political statements from our groups, sometimes they can be a bit unreadable, not clear. Yeah, that's true as well. Other things that are weak, I think, in statements, if there's no, you know, if you're doing an article about something and you go off into too many different directions. I mean, you bring in too many different. I mean, Rowan talked about it before, being too tangential. You need to keep to the point and follow it through to the end. And another error that I've made myself sometimes is where you have your article and you finish it badly. In other words, you don't tie it all together at the end. You just leave it hanging. I think it's very important to bring everything together and check once you finish the article that it makes sense from beginning to end. And yeah, they're the points I wanted to make just roughly about bad writing. There is bad writing, and we did have examples that I think went out, didn't it, Rowan? We did put them out so you can actually read the bad examples. Plus, George Orwell does refer to a few bad examples in his piece, so you can look at bad examples there. It's basically the reverse of what Tansy and me and everyone else has been saying, really. It's the opposite of that. Okay, I'll leave it there, but read the Hemingway piece. It's very good as well.
Thank you. And yeah, if they haven't been sent out, we can always send them out as well. So we can do so afterwards. Unfortunately, Kevin, I'm probably not able to take a question right now because we're sort of running short and I don't want to cut too much into people's lunchtimes. I'm just going to post some articles and stuff. These aren't examples of good or bad writing. Most of them are very basic and bland. Some of them aren't. They're just prompts for you to think about writing in different subjects. You can take them, you can leave them. Another prompt idea that I want to put out generally is reviews. You know, if you want to think about reviewing something you're interested in, something an art piece you like, an art piece you really don't like, etc. I didn't want to give examples of that because it's likely to be more personal to you, what kind of thing you want to take on. And in any medium, you know, you can review games, you can review galleries, you can review poetry, you can review novels. So we're going to take a break now and reconvene. Let me make sure I get this right so everyone doesn't leave with the wrong time in the head. We're going to reconvene at 2:30. And if you want to write a short piece, you know, just a few hundred words for us to look at in the second section, we're going to do breakout rooms so everyone gets a bit more attention. Then please do so. And you can use any of those prompts. You can find your own prompts, or you can just do something that you've already got in your mind to do. So now we're going to sort of go into lunch break. I just want to particularly thank Tanzi and Maya for their contributions. Both are welcome to stay, although I'm not sure they're able to. It's been really fantastic hearing both of you. Really incredible contributions that have I think made the event what it is. So thank you very much. And I hope everyone enjoys their writing, and I hope you all enjoy your lunch. Thank you.